May 1899. One of the best loved and most reliable mail steamships of the time is off the English coast. She's commanded by an experienced and well-liked skipper, a poster child for the American line, and a trusted ambassador for the company. At 6 p.m. that Saturday night, the ship's engines rumble to life again after a brief stop at Cherbourg to take on passengers before starting out for New York on the usual transatlantic run. But this time, she wouldn't make it. Between the ship and her destination is a treacherous bit of coastline, Cornwall and the dreaded Manacles. You see them described variously as rocks or a reef, but to ships, either way, they're a death sentence manifest, an intimidating foe that could tear the bottom out of a vessel and send it below in minutes. The danger is well known by then, and systems have been put in place to make sure that captains know that they're entering the danger zone. Running at high speed, the steamer heads right for the coast so a captain can get his bearings before pointing her nose out west towards the open ocean. He should be able to see the lights of the coast by now, the Eddystone Lighthouse or the Lizard Lighthouse. They've been put in place specifically to help guide ships out of harm's way, but a dense, misty rain has come in and it envelops the ship like a fog. The captain strains to see into the distance, when suddenly, at around 1 a.m, there comes a grinding, screeching roar from deep below. Everything rattles, the ship's wheel in the hands of the wide-eyed quartermaster, the railings gripped by crew who vainly try to see into the murk. Sleeping soundly in their bunks, passengers are shaken awake as their ship lifts its body clean from the sea and grinds along, shredding its steel like it was made of foil. Captain Frederick Watkins is suddenly presented with a horrifying realization. He's driven his ship straight into harm's way, directly onto one of the most dangerous maritime hazards in the world. Just the year prior, the SS Mohegan, a steamship just like his, had struck and broken up. Nearly everybody aboard was lost, save for 50 lives. She'd rolled and sunk in just 12 minutes, and the captain and all of his officers had gone down with her. Now, Captain Watkins feels his own command tremble underfoot as she too comes to a grinding halt. This was the terrifying, sudden reality faced by the passengers and crew of the SS Paris. The ship had been designed and built in the 1880s, a proud symbol of progress. Along with her sister ship, the City of New York, she'd been among the first passenger liners to boast a whole suite of safety features like twin propellers, a double-bottomed hull, and a steel construction to boot. And now all those safety measures came into sudden, unexpected scrutiny because Paris had just encountered a deadly granite rock formation that has taken hundreds of ships and thousands of lives. Would she roll and sink? And if she stayed put, how could she ever hope to be recovered? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the story of the grounding of the SS Paris. In 1888, a new generation of passenger ships had thundered down the slipway at the proud firm of J&G Thompson at Clydebank, Scotland. The Inman Line, one of the largest British passenger shipping companies at the time, had commissioned a pair of sister ships so elegant in their design, so grand in scale, and so quick in their speed that they would dominate the lucrative transatlantic route out to New York. The pair introduced some huge steps forward at a time when passenger ships were only just beginning to be made out of steel. Don't let their quaint, old-world exteriors fool you. Inman Line purposely chose a more classic yacht-like appearance, but beneath the old-timey stylistic touches beat the mechanical hearts of a pair of technologically advanced Victorian marvels. I could write thousands of words about the beauty of their interiors. The towering, spectacular dining saloon with its massive arched skylight, or the ornately carved wood panels of the library. It's hard to look at photos of these two ships on the inside and realize they were built a full 2 decades before the likes of Titanic and Olympic. But they were. In reality though, where City of New York and Paris really pushed the envelope was in their machinery and their safety. They had their hulls divided into 16 watertight compartments by bulkheads, those towering interior steel walls that rose up high above the waterline to the saloon deck. Their twin triple expansion steam engines, each with its own screw propeller, drove the ships to then record-setting speeds, smashing the standing best and holding the blue ribbon prize for the Inman Line for nearly half a decade at a time when shipping lines scrambled furiously to outperform one another every season. Even then, their record was only bested by 2 hours, and their average speed was only 3 knots less than that of the impressive Lusitania and Mauritania built some 20 years later. So, this pair of brilliant ships went on to endear themselves to the travelling Victorian public, arriving with impressive regularity off Sandy Hook ready to quarantine and dock in New York at the Inman Pier. But a ship without its crew was really just an elaborate lump of floating metal, and the Inman line had some of the most experienced men at its disposal. They'd been in the business since 1850, after all, and one of their most popular was Captain Frederick Watkins. See, back then, the job of the captain of a great express mail liner was almost as focused on acting as an ambassador for the line as it was in actually operating the ship at his disposal. In that regard, Watkins was second to none. A publication at the time read, "The minute you set a foot aboard the deck, you will like Captain Frederick Watkins." He'd been with the company a long time. They'd even made him their Commodore. An 1887 run of cigarette cards depicted him in full colour, and he was everything at first glance you'd expect an experienced skipper to be, bearded, beaming with pride at his command. He was nicknamed the Gentleman Captain, and he must have lavished his attention on his passengers at dinners in that elegant, swaying saloon aboard City of New York and her sister City of Paris. One sailor once said of Watkins that he's made of the right sort of stuff for a mariner. This was the age when regular passengers would book the same ships largely because they liked the captain in command. Watkins was the sort who drew passengers in with his warmth and presided over his ship with happy and fair judgment. But the line he so excellently represented, Inman Line, was unfortunately no stranger to incidents and tragedy. In fact, the line's very first ship had simply disappeared at sea with all hands. The City of Glasgow, a paddle steamer, left Liverpool with nearly 500 aboard in 1854 and was never seen again. Then in 1870, the City of Boston, a modern steamship just 6 years old, set off from Liverpool with around 200 aboard and disappeared too. In 1883, the City of Brussels, a speed record holder for the line, was lost in a horror collision near Liverpool that took 10 lives. And then, in 1887, when City of New York and Paris were both still being completed, the Inman liner, City of Montreal, was 2 days delayed getting into port. Now, these were the days before Marconi radio communications, and delays, by the order of days, weren't uncommon. It was only later that an urgent cable brought terrible news. The ship had been completely consumed by fire. She'd been carrying 8,000 bales of American cotton when it combusted and went up like a bonfire. The 73rd ship to do so in just half a year. The quick-acting crew managed to evacuate all but one boat, with 13 aboard, became separated in heavy seas. It was feared lost, but fortunately all 234 aboard the ship survived and the missing boat was miraculously found and rescued. So it was that the Inman Line set about designing and building its newest generation of ships with safety first and foremost in mind. Something which accounts for the obsessive attention to detail in the features found aboard City of Paris and New York. For comparison, if Titanic's bulkheads had risen as high in the hull, comparatively, as did the Inman ships, then she probably wouldn't have sunk after hitting the berg. The two sisters were the first liners to boast twin propellers. They had big, modern steel hulls, and crucially, they featured double bottoms. This was essentially an inner skin on the very floor of the ship, designed to protect against the kind of damage you'd get from scraping over the top of something, and it was this exact feature, which along with the watertight bulkheads would be put to the test in the very near future. It would turn out that the Inman Line had built a pair of liners that would have very lively and dramatic careers. They operated with great success in their early years and beyond, but drama always seemed to follow wherever they went. City of Paris seemed to somehow always get the worst of it. In October 1889, the ship ran into rough weather out of Liverpool that delayed her by hours. Finally making it into New York, reporters were told dramatic tales of enormous waves, one which had apparently washed a Swedish woman and her child overboard. Then, a few months later, in January, the ship was making her way up the Mersey with Watkins in command when she bumped into an outward-bound steamer in a dense fog. The ship's enormous bowsprit was torn clean off, and passengers were shaken, but nobody was hurt. But the worst was still to come, because in March, City of Paris ran into some serious trouble. On the 29th, the New York Times ran with a concerning story. The ship, which regularly made the crossing within 6 days, was 3 days overdue. 9 days is a very long time for such a record breaker as the city of Paris, ran the article, and it continued, "This delay has naturally caused much uneasiness among those who have friends on the city of Paris, and there is also some anxiety manifested at the offices of the Inland Line's agents. That some break in the machinery has occurred is regarded as by far the most reasonable cause to assign for the length of the voyage. That, it would turn out, would be a huge understatement. What had actually happened is City of Paris's engines had virtually exploded into pieces, sending chunks of metal tearing through bulkheads and even into public rooms. The ship had come to a sudden, dramatic stop. The crew had then sprung into action, shutting watertight doors and sounding the ship. Investigations found that the starboard propeller shaft had broken near the propeller, and suddenly, without warning, 8,000 horsepower was let loose of the burden of spinning the shaft, and the engine raced with no way of stopping or slowing it down until it just self-destructed with incredible force. New York-based civil engineer Mirs Coriel said that photos of the aftermath revealed such a complete destruction as to signalise this accident as the most remarkable on record, exceeding the possibilities of imagination. Crucially, the engine room had immediately flooded, but the ship's watertight compartments held, and passengers were treated to the bizarre sight of crew bailing water overboard in buckets because the ship's pumps had been flooded out too. An opinion piece said that, in one respect, the efficiency of a modern appliance for safety has been amply vindicated by this latest accident. It said that the watertight bulkhead had until then been looked at by many as a vain device. In fact, 2 of City of Paris's watertight compartments had been flooded, and yet the ship hadn't sunk. A triumph for Inland Line and their vessel. Fortunately, nobody was hurt or killed, but it was a very close shave that would have sunk a lesser or slightly older ship. It would take nearly an entire year for the City of Paris to be repaired and rebuilt with new engines, and in May 1891 she was ready, this time with a device to cut engine revs should they race away again. For the next few years, aside from the occasional storm, like the one in October 1891 that swept passengers from their feet and ripped 10 feet of bow railing away, things were good for the City of Paris. In 1893, Inland Line was merged into American Line, and the ship became known simply as Paris. Now an American-flagged vessel, she saw service in the Spanish-American War as a raider, equipped with no fewer than 12 6-inch guns. After a lively wartime career that saw her capture a Spanish steamship and get fired on by the big guns of a fort, Paris was back in passenger service in late 1898 with Frederick Watkins once again on the bridge. So it was, in May 1899, that Paris was steaming out of Cherbourg after picking up about 50 more passengers to bring her total complement to 802 on board. American Line had shifted Paris's base of operations and those of her sister New York from Liverpool to Southampton, and it allowed the ships to call by the European continent on their way past. This handy stopover did present captains with a slight challenge though, because looming over the French coast is Cornwall, which stretches like a finger out west and dangles dangerously downwards so that the captains coming out of Cherbourg need to steam in a kind of awkward southwesterly course to avoid something called the Lizard. This is the southernmost tip of mainland Britain, a peninsula of rocky coastline well known as an infamous ship graveyard. In the late 1700s, a lighthouse was built to warn ships away, but the light was also a useful tool in determining the point at which a captain had navigated his ship clear of the British mainland and could at last breathe a little easier and set course out west for the open ocean and New York. Now, this was only the second time that Watkins and his crew had had to deal with a Cherbourg stopover and the navigational challenges it presented, but they pressed on. At about 6 p.m, Paris had set out from Cherbourg in a calm sea and perfect conditions, but then nature intervened. A light, misty rain had crept over the channel that enveloped Paris in a dense cloud that was as effective at blotting out vision as fog is. Watkins pressed on and decided to make for the Lizard Point light because once he could see that, or the Eddystone light on his starboard bow, he would know for certain he was in the clear and could begin the voyage in earnest without fear of running into Cornwall. With their engines thumping along and passengers sitting down for tea, Paris chugged through the misty night. Watkins knew that standard procedure was to pass well to the south of the light, as much as 12 or 15 miles, that's 24 kilometres, which is normally where the light would still be visible. But with his ship shrouded in rain, it was impossible to see. Paris groped blindly ahead, with Watkins' officers taking compass readings to plot their direction. But with no visual aids, there was simply no way of knowing exactly where they were on the chart. Presumably ahead, somewhere, lay a 14-mile, 23-kilometre-long shipwrecking coastline, but it was impossible to pick out through the murk. They were well aware of the risks, though. The Manacles and the Cornish coast had claimed hundreds and hundreds of ships. In 1855, a migrant ship named the John had hit the rocks and took 200 people down with her. In 1891, a brand new sailing ship, Bay of Panama, got caught in a blizzard that sent her straight onto the rocks as well and killed nearly 30. But the tragedy that had most reminded navigators of the danger was a steamer named the Mohegan. Just the year prior, in October 1898, the ship had set out for New York, running at full speed when her crew took the wrong bearing. She buzzed past the coastline so closely that experienced Coast Guardsmen and lifeboatsmen ashore knew what was about to happen and either tried to signal her with rockets or simply got their boats ready for a rescue. Mohegan hit the Cairn Dhu Rock with a judder that tore a length of her hull open. Passengers and crew rushed to the boat deck for evacuation, but their ship wasn't stuck fast. It suddenly rolled and sank within just 12 minutes, so that only its funnel and 4 masts could be seen poking pathetically out above the surface of the water. Of 157 aboard, only about 50 were saved. Now, this must have passed through Captain Watkins' mind that night as his ship raced on through the night. Remarkably, he and his men were so confident they were on the right track, they didn't slow their ship, and reports had her steaming at 18 or 19 knots, nearly full speed. Nearing 1 AM, passengers had turned in after a long day of boarding procedure, and most had fallen into a deep sleep. But Watkins and his officers kept silent vigil on the bridge as Paris sped on ahead, the men on watch keeping a sharp eye out for the Eddystone Lighthouse or the light at Lizard Point. Suddenly, there came a panicked shout from above. The lookout could make something out in the murky darkness. Rolling hills, the shoreline. Watkins had been nearly 20 miles off course, and now Paris was barreling down on the coast. The veteran skipper sprang into action. He ordered the ship's wheel hard over, sending her bow to port. The engine telegraphs rang as he ordered the port propeller run full astern. The action changed the ship's course at the last moment to try and clear her nose of the shore, but then came that jolt, a slight grazing and then a second, harsher impact that shook the ship underfoot. Passengers asleep in their bunks were shaken awake. Londoner Thomas Allen, en route to appear as a witness in a fraud case back in New York, said, "I heard a grating sound and then several hard thumps on the rocks that shook the ship. The vessel then seemed to stop dead." Paris' progress was finally checked and she came to a halt. Watkins telegraphed down for the engines to be stopped too and stepped out to survey the situation. Before him was a coastline with green hills peeking out from the rain clouds just 200 yards, or about 180 metres away. There was no time to lose. Watkins' mind had raced to the Mohegan, which had rolled suddenly and without warning, before any serious evacuation could be performed. He hailed his officers to rouse everyone and prepare the boats. Fortunately, it was a perfectly calm night and the boats could get away safely, so his men sprang into action. Confused passengers stepped out into their corridors and their pyjamas to see what the fuss was about. "I could see the land quite plainly," one woman said. "I thought the ship had stopped to take on passengers. I didn't think there was anything wrong and I returned to bed and stayed there half an hour." But throughout the ship, stewards had got to work knocking on doors and getting people up and into their life jackets. Thomas Allen recalled he heard someone calling "all hands on deck" before he woke his travel mate up and rushed out. They were then told to go back to their cabin and get their life jackets. The woman passenger who'd gone back to sleep was woken by a steward finally. "There's my baby," she had replied indignantly. "Don't wake him." "If you want to save your baby," the steward calmly replied, "get up." Fear gripped the passengers, who sleepily stumbled from their cabins, dressed in pyjamas and life jackets slung over the top. But gradually, the fear subsided because Captain Watkins and his men presented the very picture of calm authority. While they were told to wait below while the boats were cleared, stewards and crew gave reassuring words and clear information about what was exactly happening, while from the bridge, Watkins delivered his orders with extreme coolness. The mood even began to lighten. One man had rushed out in a panic, dressed only in his underwear and covered by his wife's fur cape. The other passengers were smiling so much at him that his wife made him go back down and change. The mood lightened still more when the boats were finally swung out and ready for loading, and Watkins ordered that women and children were to get away first. What followed was described only as a slow procession as they marched into the boats, which lowered away and rode for the shore. Meanwhile, overhead, rockets surged into the air and burst like fireworks. A little over a mile away, at the fishing village of Shipwreck, the airbursts were plainly spotted and locals got to work to reach the site and provide help. They must have feared the worst, having bared witness to dozens of tragedies along their coastline, but little did they, or Captain Watkins, know just how fortunate Paris had been. The creeping dawn presented a very strange sight. The SS Paris, high and dry with a little cluster of lifeboats, gathered nearby. She had hit at nearing high tide, and she had run into the Ray Rocks, just off Lowland Point. Here, the depth under keel suddenly falls from 33 fathoms, or just under 200 feet, to about 13 fathoms, or 78 feet, within just a few hundred yards. Paris had run onto one of the Ray Rocks, which presented a flat bottom, while a pair of taller rocks either side gripped her hull and held her pointed upright. Her bow reared up and the bowsprit soared high into the air, but the ship was stuck fast. Amazingly, she had passed Mohegan's wreck so closely that she could have very nearly hit it, and came to rest about 1 mile further southwest of where that ship's masts and funnel still peaked out above the water. In fact, it was so close that one passenger, a ship's captain from Pittsburgh named McCallan, had spotted the masts as he was rushing on deck to evacuate Paris. Paris's evacuation had been a roaring success, thanks to Watkins and his crew as they calmly conducted affairs on their ship, but thanks also to the residents of Shipwreck, who had seen the rockets and then rushed to the liner's assistance, sending out a lifeboat crew first and then a veritable flotilla of tugs and smaller vessels that had come from Falmouth. Captain Watkins had gone ashore in his boat to find a telegraph and send for help, and the small boat swarmed around Paris's hull to take on passengers until the liner had been totally emptied. The tug Dragon took on most, but they had to leave their trunks and possessions behind them. By 7 AM, all the passengers had been taken back to Falmouth to be quartered in hotels and the local sailors' home, while the mess was sorted out. Meanwhile, Watkins was back aboard his ship, and aghast at his predicament. He and his men had driven one of the favourite transatlantic express mail steamers straight into the coast on a calm night, with only a mist to blame. A misty rain was falling, said one captain nearby who'd rushed Paris's aid, and we saw the coastline nearly all the way from the Lizard. It's impossible for me to understand how the Paris got into that position any better than the Mohegan. But the cause for the impact would need to be investigated later, because for the time being, Watkins had a much greater issue. His ship, one of the American line's darlings, was stuck fast on the rock. But worst of all, many of her compartments had been breached. 17,000 tons of steel hull had met hardened granite, and the steel had lost out. Her sides and her bottom had been ripped open like tinfoil, although nobody could really see the worst of the damage because the holds were already well underwater. In fact, water sloshed around in almost every compartment throughout the hull. High tide came and went, but Paris stayed put. She was clearly stuck, and the old liner wasn't going anywhere. It had been a very close shave. Paris's officers had made a last-second dash to swing the ship's bow around, turning the helm hard to starboard to clear the Manacles when they'd realised their mistake. She was obviously going to go aground. That couldn't be avoided. But if the worst of the rocks could be dodged, then she might just run afoul of some soft silt or lesser rocks instead. It had probably saved the lives of many on board because Paris cleared the Manacles and the wreck of the Mohegan just and came to rest off Lowland Point, with her bow still pointing southwest. Day trippers came out in their scores to look on in bemusement at the sight of a large liner stuck fast on the rocks with seemingly no chance of escape. Typically, this is a death sentence for big ships. With only part of their massive bulk supported by rocks beneath them, big seas can easily break the vessel's back. In big storms, steamships could be dismantled entirely down to their keels by massive waves within just a few days. If the ship couldn't be floated off at high tide, then chances are she'd be a total write-off along with most of her valuable cargo. The crew had to act quickly. With his passengers off the ship, Captain Watkins and his men remained behind to get her off to safety. 3 powerful tugs came alongside and took on the big steel hawsers and cables that linked them to the ship, and as the tide surged, Paris's own engines thundered to life again, her propellers chopping the water into white rage, but it was no use. After half an hour, Paris didn't even move an inch. An attempt was made again a few days later, and for 2 hours the tugs and the Paris toiled with all their might, but still the Oceanliner refused to budge. The American line announced that it had conferred with officials from Southampton and the Admiralty and would make the final, strongest attempt to free their ship. On Thursday the 25th, no fewer than 5 tugs came alongside and pulled with all their power, but even with coal removed by the ton, Paris obstinately refused to move. Something drastic needed to be done, but because the weather remained calm and the sea was flat, it was thought Paris might not be a write-off after all, and a serious salvage attempt could be made. A contract went out, British firms backed out, but in the end, a German firm came up with a plan. It was incredibly dangerous work, but they suggested blasting the rock that was trapping Paris away with dynamite. First, the bow would need to be lightened. The damaged and flooded compartments were partially patched and pumped dry, removing a few hundred tons of water weight, and the cargo was shifted further aft. Then, about 1,000 tons of granite rock was taken onto the stern to weigh it down even more. Divers would need to drill down into the rock around Paris and plant explosives. With the rock blasted clean away, the ship would, at high tide, in theory be able to float and be towed slightly backwards so that divers could again get in under the ship and complete the patching job from the outside. Of course, once Paris was afloat, she was at risk of sinking for good, like the Mohegan, so this job was especially critical. In early June, everything was set. The weather had, by some miracle, held out just fine, and a high tide and favourable winds was predicted for the 11th. The whole time, Captain Watkins, his officers, and about 20 members of the crew had stayed on board to oversee things from the ship. Finally, the day had arrived. With thunderous booms, the explosives went off, and 15,000 feet of hardened granite rock was blasted away. To the salvage team's delight, something unexpected happened. Favourable winds brought a higher tide than expected, and with a jolt, Paris lifted up from the rocks just ever so slightly. German salvage boats, including the steamer Bertilda, took her in tow, with British tugs waiting nearby, eager for the call for aid. It would bring them a hefty payday, but remarkably, the Germans managed to get Paris's stern swung gingerly around, and she crept ever so slightly off what could easily have been her grave. By the end of the day, Paris was stopped, afloat, but listing badly to starboard, about 150 yards to the east from where she'd been trapped. But then they stopped. Elated by their success, the salvors had to get divers in the water and the ship's hull patched up, but the weather had taken a turn, with fog and rain coming in. Paris was anchored in place under the watchful eye of the coast guards, while Watkins and his men kept themselves busy manning the pumps that were keeping water out as it seeped into the damaged holds. A few days later, on July 13th, spectators were treated to an unexpected sight as SS Paris limped slowly into Falmouth Harbour, guided by tugs. It hadn't been easy going. With the hull patched and the ship's boilers lit, she'd been led past the Manacles, but almost wrecked again. At ebb tide, a northerly wind picked up and seized on the ship's hull and her towering masts. Her bow pointed ominously towards the Manacles, and she came within 400 yards of hitting them. The salvors, under command of the Superintendent Esbert, managed to clear the rocks and gingerly nurse the wounded liner to Falmouth, but then the ship was caught by the wind once again, and as Paris was coming alongside the dock, her stern swung around completely by surprise and slammed directly into the wooden pier that was now crowded with onlookers. They ran and dived for cover, and the pier shook like a leaf, but nobody was hurt, and Paris was finally moored safely in the harbour. The German salvage team came out very happily indeed from finishing their job. After costs, they'd made some £71,000, that's nearly £8 million today, or just under 11 million US dollars. The debacle left a few big unanswered questions. Captain Watkins was a veteran of nearly 500 transatlantic crossings. He and his crew knew the Cornish coast and its lights very well. Why hadn't they slowed down? Why had the lights not been seen until it was too late? What would happen to Paris now? Could she even be saved? Naturally, all eyes fell on Watkins, and while decisions were made on what to do with Paris, an investigation was launched to figure out just what had happened. Right away, there was intense scrutiny on the Trinity board, who maintained the lights and the buoys that marked the dangerous coast. Locals had, for years, warned that the single bell buoy that marked the coastline where Paris had hit was next to useless. In fact, nobody aboard the ship even heard it. Only once she'd come to a stop, and the boats were being lowered, did anybody hear it ringing pathetically as it floated over the waves. But that didn't account for Paris's position. She should have been nowhere near that coast. Clearly, somebody had fouled up, and Captain Watkins stepped forward to take all the blame. He'd been Inman Line, and then American Line's celebrity captain, a favourite among passengers, but now he needed to explain just how he had managed to bring his ship nearly 20 miles off course and right onto one of the most dangerous shores on Earth in calm weather. I regret to say, Watkins wrote, that the casualty was owing to an unaccountable error on my part. It's about 131 miles from Cape La Hague, that's the cape just out of Cherbourg that Paris had passed, to the Lizard, and the run between these points would, I calculated, occupy 6 hours, 54 minutes. Unfortunately, I reckon the time on this basis for coming up with the Lizard from 7:35 PM when a beam of the Casquettes in the Channel Islands, instead of from 6:55 PM when a beam of Cape La Hague. Calculating this course meant Watkins had started the timer about 30 kilometres or 18 miles too late. It had happened because he had misread his officer's writing in the log and simply got the entries mixed up. This had sent Paris on a collision course with Lowland Point from the very start. But that still didn't account for the fact he never saw the lights he was trying to pick up that would tell him exactly where he was, Eddystone on the right and the Lizard on the left. He chalked it up to dense mist or fog on the land, and he ended his report virtually begging for leniency. "I've followed the sea as my profession since the year 1851, he said. I was, during the war between the United States and Spain, the navigating officer of the United States cruiser Yale. I've thought it right to place these particulars before you in the hope that you will take into consideration a long and responsible seafaring career, during which, I believe, I have throughout held the perfect confidence of my employers. The accident was not due to any want of thought or anxiety about my vessel or her safety, but arose purely from the mistake I made in making my calculations above described." This begged the question, could captains even make mistakes and get away with it? The weight of the responsibility on their heads was such that there had to be some kind of consequence, even for a simple error. A member of the Board of Commissioners of Pilots, Captain W.B. Hilton, was an experienced navigator himself, and weighed in on what happens when ship's captains make mistakes. He readily gave examples that were similar to the Paris situation, and said that in his opinion the captain's mind was as liable as any other man's to become dazed or confused. But in the end, the local inspectors were scathing. Watkins would not be let off the hook. "We find," they wrote, "that the report is very meagre in details, inasmuch as he merely states that he made a mistake. This would not account for his being set in to northward of his course some 7 miles, alluring his intention to pass the Lizard at a distance of 3 miles. As Captain Watkins does not make any mention of making any allowance for tide, we are of the opinion he had not taken that matter into consideration. Giving all due consideration to these matters, we are of the opinion that Captain Watkins has not acted with the necessary care and attention requisite in the navigation of his vessel, which a master should have used, and therefore suspend his licence as matter of ocean steamers for a period of 2 years. The case was closed." A newspaper said that Watkins looked to have shrunk to about half his size after the verdict. It had clearly been a devastating blow. Of course, any captain with such a serious charge against him could not hope to captain a big liner again. The 2-year suspension was really one for life. A melancholy picture, one paper wrote, was presented of Captain Watkins with his licence suspended, but still aboard his vessel, which he had been working for many weeks to save, and about to proceed with her to Southampton on what may be his last voyage in any official capacity. The American line told reporters that Watkins had been planning on retiring at the end of the season anyway. He had successfully captained Paris for years and years navigated her through war zones and disaster, but that final voyage was a tragic stain on his legacy. With the blame game sorted out, serious attention turned to the ship. There are a few different ways ships can be declared to be losses. A total loss, if she had remained on the rocks and been broken apart, of course. But now the question was whether or not she was a constructive total loss, that is to say, whether or not it would simply cost too much to restore her. The American line's manager stated confidently that he thought she couldn't be saved. She'd been stripped of all her cargo while still on the rocks, including 18 cases of 3,000 books bound for the University of Vermont. And while decisions were made on what to do with the ship, she was beached on a sandy strip at Falmouth for analysis. It was found that the damage wasn't as bad as initially thought, although it was still serious, and that she could be sent for repairs. But she needed an expert set of hands to be brought back to life. The natural choice was Harland & Wolff in Belfast, a legendary maritime firm who were keen to win the contract to rebuild the ship. But getting Paris there also wouldn't be easy. First, in mid-August, about 3 months after the grounding, Paris limped gingerly around the Cornish coast up to Milford Haven in Wales, where a dry dock was just big enough to fit her 17,000-ton bulk. The idea was that the ship's most serious damage would need to be filled with dense wooden patches and shored up from the inside. Paris came to rest on the dry dock floor, and workers got underway plugging the worst of the holes and preparing her for the nearly 280-mile, 440-kilometre sea voyage to Belfast. It took until January for the big patches to be finished and fitted, and on the 8th of that month, the dock was filled with water, but almost immediately Paris began to flood. Clearly, the watertight patches weren't as watertight as had been originally hoped, so the dock had to be drained again and the leak sniffed out. Over a week later, on the 18th, there was another try, and this time, at last, Paris rose with the water level and floated proudly on the surface. A few days later, big tugs secured their lines to her, and she was bodily towed, slowly but surely, for the expert workshop at Harland & Wolff. Harland & Wolff were brilliant shipbuilders. In fact, they'd only just finished making their magnum opus and the world's largest liner, the spectacular Oceanic, and they were in the process of building RMS Celtic. But they were also brilliant repairmen. They'd lengthened the ship's Scott and Augusta Victoria by cutting them in half and inserting an entirely new section, and they'd rebuilt P&O's China when she became stranded on Perim Island in the Red Sea. If anyone could repair Paris to working order, it was them, and they had a rising star in their ranks who could oversee everything with a keen eye. The job of overseeing Paris's reconditioning might have fallen to a young Mr. Thomas Andrews, head of the repair department, who was just on the cusp of becoming manager of construction work. In fact, the whole firm was fascinated with this new task and reported, after looking the ship over, that a full rebuild would be necessary to bring life back to the old ship. American Line sensed an opportunity to reintroduce the liner as virtually a new vessel, so Harland & Wolff got to work. Yard photographer Robert Welsh tracked progress on the liner very closely, and it was clear the firm wanted to use Paris as a portfolio piece. First, the ship's 3 funnels were stripped off, so her machinery could be got at from above. The casings were ripped out of her, then the old boilers and the engines, the ones which had been installed after the original set exploded. With the heavy machinery unseated, Paris's underside could be cut cleanly away, keel and all, and the photos show a gaping hole where once the ship's double bottom had been. Like Dr. Frankenstein in a surgery, the Harland & Wolff men cut with oxy torches and hammered at red-hot rivets. Meanwhile, at the engine works, a new set of triple expansion steam engines was prepared that would bring a new era of reliability and speed to the old liner. With the bottom repaired, the new machinery was lowered in from above. Meanwhile, Harland & Wolff took the opportunity to transform the ship's old stern, ripping out the original post and rudder and replacing them with a more current counter-stern and clipper rudder. The work took over a year, and by August 22, 1901, the new ship was ready to leave for Southampton. Much of her exterior looked similar, save for the stern of course, and one major change up top. Where once there had been 3 smartly proportioned funnels, there were now 2 taller ones. Trials showed that the ship was running better than ever, and American Line gladly accepted the liner back. It had been a long, winding path, but new life was breathed into the ship that had once been known as Paris. To distance her from the disaster and to lean into the idea that Harland & Wolff had essentially built them a new ship, she was rechristened Philadelphia. While American Line was happy with the reintroduction of their vessel, naturally, the loser in the situation had been Captain Frederick Watkins. But rather than disappear solemnly into obscurity, Watkins, in late 1899, seemed to have had enough and wanted to put up a fight. In October that year, he had left Paris at Wales and sailed to New York to appeal his suspended license. By its confounded impudence, he said bluntly, the British Board of Trade put its nose into the business, and it's responsible for the length of the suspension. My friends went to General Dumont, who was at the head of the inspectors, asking him not to be too severe. They seemed to think that 2 months was enough. He replied, "Oh well, Watkins is more than 70. Now, Dumont himself is more than 75, and he was never a sailor." He continued, "I'm going to fight this thing right straight through. I am touched by the expressions of sympathy and the many cordial letters I've received." SS Philadelphia, formerly the Paris, went on to have a fine career, serving as a testbed for wireless communication by Guglielmo Marconi, and then in the First World War as a troop transport. She made it into the 20s, when, 2 years into that decade, she was stranded in the Bay of Naples by her crew when they mutinied and burned her. The ship met an inglorious end after 34 years of lively service. It had definitely been a rollercoaster of a career, but she finally met her end at the hands of the scrapper and his torch in 1923. Today, if you visit the town of Coverack, near the point where the ship was grounded in 1899, you'll find a charming little establishment with a fine model of the ship above its bar. It's aptly named the Paris Hotel. In the end, Captain Watkins' name wasn't clear, and his career at sea was well and truly over. Sometimes, said a 1912 article, a captain, after meeting with misfortune, drops completely out of sight, and no one knows what his fate has been. Captain Frederick Watkins is, or perhaps was, one of these. A slight miscalculation on the part of Captain Watkins sent his vessel upon the Manacles rocks on the Cornish coast, and now you may search all the obscure places of the earth, and you may not find him. Even when no blame can be attached, it continued, to a captain for a disaster to his boat, he nearly always pays the bitter price demanded by the unwritten law of the sea. But the simple truth was probably more bureaucratic, more banal than anything else. Maritime underwriters. If the accident is more than slight, the article helpfully explains, a letter is at once written to the officials of the line that operate the boat, warning them that the insurance rates will be jumped to prohibitive figures if the captain who had charge of the ill-fated boat is not dropped from the service at once. And so it is that virtually every accident upon the seas has its tragedy, whether lives are lost or not. And for that same reason, men whose names are formerly ranked high in marine circles are now ending their broken lives in obscure employment, victims of the mistake of a moment or an hour which the record of years of skill and devotion could not avail to overcome. It ended with this poem, attributed to Kipling. I may not hope to gain my life, but a higher price I pay, the skill and toil of 30 years, for the fault of half a day.